Story 1. The Strange Encounter, Late at Night. That night, I had just finished a late work shift and decided to drive home. The streets were deserted, the air cold, and dark clouds gathered overhead, obscuring the moonlight. The road I was driving on was already quiet, located on the outskirts of town, far from the city center. The streetlights flickered weakly, and the faint glow from residential windows made the atmosphere even more silent, almost devoid of sound, except for the soft hiss of the tires on the asphalt. I felt uneasy, like something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Oddly, every time I drove on this road before, I felt fine, but tonight, the atmosphere felt thicker, almost as if I was being watched. The feeling kept intensifying, and I couldn't explain why. As I passed a few narrow turns, I started to feel mentally drained, probably from a long, tiring day at work. I told myself that once I got home and rested, everything would be fine. However, just as I was driving through an empty stretch of road, I suddenly noticed a figure standing by the roadside. I squinted, trying to make out who it was, and soon realized it was a woman standing right at the edge of the road. She wasn't walking. She was standing still, not moving, as if waiting for someone. At first, I thought she might be in trouble. I didn't suspect anything sinister at the time, but wondered if she needed help. Since it was late, and this area was quite remote, I hesitated, unsure whether I should stop or not. However, a part of me felt compelled to stop and help, thinking that if she was lost or in distress, maybe I could do something to assist. I slowed down and decided to stop. When my car came to a full stop, I looked over at her through the window. She was wearing a white dress, which seemed strange because no one would wear something like that at this hour. Her appearance wasn't normal either. The white dress looked tattered, as if it had been worn for a long time without care. Her hair was long and messy, fluttering lightly in the cold night wind, but she didn't seem cold at all. My headlights illuminated her figure, and it was then I noticed she was standing motionless, staring straight ahead, her eyes not moving, not looking at me. That gaze made me feel an eerie chill. It wasn't the gaze of an ordinary person. "Are you okay?" I called out, but she didn't respond. I asked again, "Do you need help? I can call a tow truck for you." Although I felt a little uneasy, I told myself that stopping to help might not be such a big deal. After all, it was late, and she could be lost or in some kind of trouble. But she still stood there, silent and unresponsive. I rolled the window down a little more and asked once again, trying to remain calm, "Are you sure you're okay?" But there was still no answer. At this point, the unsettling feeling inside me grew even stronger. My heart started to race. I could sense an unusual silence surrounding me. Not a single sound. It felt like the air in the car had become heavier. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel her gaze, although she wasn't looking directly at me, penetrating the space and creeping into every fiber of my being. I started to feel fear, and a thought suddenly flashed through my mind. Run. Don't stop. But my rational mind told me to stay brave, that she was just a lost person, someone in need of help. I couldn't stand it any longer. The sense of dread was too overwhelming. I decided to step out of the car. Although I didn't know why I was doing this, I felt like I needed to understand what was happening. I stepped outside, and as I approached her, something compelled me to stop. She slowly turned her face toward me. It wasn't a normal look. It was an empty stare. Not the eyes of a living person. Her eyes were like two bottomless pits, devoid of any emotion. Then she smiled, but it wasn't a smile of a human being. Her mouth twisted into a strange grin, unlike any smile I had ever seen. It was unnaturally wide, enough for me to see her sharp, pointed teeth, like some creature not of this world. She didn't say anything but just stared at me, her gaze cold, as though she had been watching me for a long time. And then suddenly, she spoke a sentence that almost made my legs give way. "Run, or it will be too late." Just then I heard a noise from behind, like footsteps softly echoing, growing closer and closer. I turned around to look, but all I saw was the impenetrable darkness. No one, nothing. At that moment, fear surged within me like never before. I couldn't hesitate anymore. Without thinking, I rushed back to the car, jumped in, locked the doors, and hit the gas, speeding away. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my eyes refusing to look back. My heart was pounding like something enormous was chasing me. When I finally reached home, the panic still clung to me. That was when I realized I hadn't seen her anymore, nor had I heard any noises behind my car. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, I saw her again, standing on the side of the road, silent. She was still standing there, just like when I first stopped. But this time, she wasn't smiling anymore. I couldn't sleep the whole night. The fear haunted me. And then, the next morning, I heard a story from a friend. She told me about a mysterious disappearance that had occurred a few years ago, right on the road I had just driven on. A woman, described as looking exactly like the girl from that night, had vanished without a trace. They say that on late nights, she still appears on that road. Since then, I haven't dared to drive down that road again. Story 2. The figure behind the window. That night, my friend and I were driving home after a late party in the city. The highway was deserted, with only a few cars passing by occasionally, but for the most part, we were the only ones on the road. It was about 2 a.m., and the cold wind was blowing through the cracks of the window, but neither of us paid much attention to it. As we drove past an area with few houses, I noticed a faint light in the distance, as though there was a house with a light on. It wasn't a normal house, one we were familiar with, but an old, dilapidated one, clearly abandoned for years. The windows were shattered, and the wooden planks on the outside were rotting, with the whole house immersed in an eerie sense of decay. Despite this, the faint light from within spilled out, casting small patches of light onto the empty road. Both my friend and I felt something strange, but no one said anything. As we continued driving, I remembered that we had passed through an area with no gas stations or stores, and this house was the only one with light. After a moment of silence, I said, "It feels like someone's inside. Should we check it out?" My friend didn't respond, only staring at the house. I slowed the car down and pulled over to the side of the road. I decided to get out and approach the house. There was something about it that made me feel like someone, or something, was waiting for us. As I walked toward the house, an eerie sensation washed over me, as if I were being watched. When I reached the shattered window, I could see inside, but it was quite dark. The window was broken, with glass shards scattered across the floor, yet there was no sign of life. There was no sound, only the terrifying silence. I could almost hear the wind howling through the cracks of the house, carrying a chilling cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I leaned toward the window, intending to peer inside, but suddenly, I felt a shiver run down my spine. In that moment, I saw a figure standing inside, right by the window. At first, I thought it was just someone alive, perhaps the homeowner or a stranger. But as I looked closer, I realized that the person stood perfectly still, motionless, as if unaware of my presence. The faint light wasn't enough to reveal their face, but I could make out a vague figure and part of their tattered clothing. My legs began to tremble, and I couldn't understand why I felt so terrified. But what truly horrified me was the realization that the figure wasn't moving. They stood there silently and immobile, though I could feel their gaze fixed on me from inside the house. I turned to look at my friend, and when I turned back to the window, The figure was gone. In its place was an empty, lifeless space. I exhaled, relieved, but the unease in me only grew stronger. I began to step back, but as I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound, like the soft creak of footsteps coming from inside the house. I didn't dare to look back. I just hurriedly ran back to the car. When I jumped back into the car and started it, I couldn't bring myself to glance behind me. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. But as I drove past the house again, something caught my eye. I looked up and saw the figure standing at the window again. This time they weren't alone. Another figure stood next to the first one, as though two people were staring at me from within the darkness. We quickly sped away from that road, and as the car moved out of the area, I didn't dare to look back. I couldn't sleep the whole night, and the cold, strange feeling I experienced kept haunting me. The next morning I told my friends about what had happened, and they informed me that the house had been abandoned for a long time. Apparently, years ago, a strange murder had taken place there. A family had vanished without a trace, and no one knew what had happened to them. Perhaps I had encountered the ghosts of that family.
Story 3. The Old Driver and the Encounter on the Empty Road. It was a cold winter night when I had just finished a late shift and was driving home on an empty highway. It was well past midnight, and the chilling wind made everything feel strangely eerie. The highway was nearly deserted at this hour, the silence so profound that I could hear the hum of my car's engine echoing through the darkness. It felt as though I was driving alone in a quiet, desolate world. The night was pitch black, and the headlights only illuminated a small stretch of road ahead. The farther I went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if some unseen presence was surrounding the road. I glanced at my watch. I was only a few miles from home, yet the feeling of anxiety refused to leave me, as if someone was watching. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, eager to get home. After driving for a while, I noticed a truck parked on the side of the road in the distance, its headlights still on. The truck looked old and dirty, but what caught my attention was the figure of a man standing beside it, wearing a thick, worn-out coat, his hair entirely white, and he appeared exhausted. The man wasn't walking around, he just stood there, waving his hand. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should stop. Part of me wanted to help, feeling something wasn't quite right. But another part of me warned against stopping in such a desolate place at this time of night. However, after a moment of indecision, I decided to pull over. If he was in trouble, I couldn't just drive past him. As I stopped the car, the man walked over and stood by my window. I rolled it down slightly and asked, "What's going on? Do you need help?" He looked at me with cloudy eyes, his lips cracked and dry, and spoke in a hoarse, fatigued voice. "My truck broke down. Can you help me fix it?" His voice sounded as though he hadn't rested in days, weak and raspy. I glanced over at the truck, but saw no sign of any breakdown. The tires were fully inflated, and there was no broken glass or damage to it. But I didn't say anything and simply asked, "Do you need me to call a tow service?" He shook his head, then looked at me with tired eyes, replying, "No, just take me to the nearest gas station. I can't walk anymore." I felt uneasy, but couldn't bring myself to turn him down. He looked so pitiful, and the area was so desolate, just dark and cold. I decided to help him, thinking that it would be safe. I opened the door and let him in. As he sat down, a strong smell of sweat hit me, and I could hear his labored breathing as if he hadn't slept in days. But what was strange was how uncomfortable I felt. It was as though something was wrong, as if there was some invisible presence beside me. I tried to push the feeling away and reassured him, "We'll be at the nearest gas station soon, don't worry." When I turned back to focus on driving, I glanced in the rearview mirror and suddenly realized
The truck had disappeared. There was no trace of it. I froze for a moment, thinking I must have imagined it, but just moments ago, I had clearly seen the truck parked on the side of the road. That strange sensation grew even stronger, confusing me further. I glanced at the man again, but he sat there, silently, not saying anything. A part of me wanted to ask him more questions, but there was something about him that kept me from speaking. The unease in my chest grew slowly, steadily. Suddenly, I heard him cough weakly and ask, "Have you ever felt like something is watching you?" His question startled me, and I didn't know how to answer. I tried to avoid looking at him too much, but then the silence in the car became oppressive. The air felt thick, suffocating. I even felt like the atmosphere inside the car had changed. My heart raced, not from fear of him, but from a deep sense that he wasn't a normal person. I couldn't explain it, but something about him made me wary. As we drove further, I looked back in the rearview mirror once more, and again. The truck was no longer behind me. I struggled to stay calm, saying nothing, just continuing to drive. But when I glanced at the man, he was staring out the window, his eyes half closed as if he were drifting into a trance. The strange feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I didn't know why, but I had a powerful sense that he wasn't human. Suddenly, he turned to look at me, and in that moment, I could hardly believe my eyes. His face was no longer the same as it had been earlier. His silver hair and wrinkled face had turned ghostly white, and his eyes no longer held the life of a human being. They were cold, deep, and unnatural. His mouth twisted into a grimace as if trying to smile, but it wasn't a human smile. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I immediately slowed down and asked, "Are you feeling okay?" But there was no answer. His eyes remained locked on mine, as if they were piercing through me. Then, suddenly, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "You shouldn't keep driving." The words felt like a warning, but I couldn't understand why they sounded like they were coming from some otherworldly force. At that moment, I heard a loud noise from behind the car, as if someone had slammed their fist against the door. I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror and saw only a misty haze, like a shadowy figure chasing after me. Suddenly my car jerked, and a jolt of cold energy ran through my body, making everything blur for an instant. When I looked back, the man was gone. There was no sign of him in the car. I couldn't believe my eyes and quickly floored the accelerator, trying to escape the area. I sped away, but the strange feeling still clung to me. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, only to find that not only had the truck vanished, but so had the figure of the man. Finally, when I got home, I still couldn't understand what had just happened. As I sat in my car, I heard a soft tapping on the window, as if someone were trying to get my attention. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I didn't know what to make of what I had just experienced. Later, when I told my friends about it, they told me that the truck I had seen didn't exist. They said it had been years since a driver had died in a crash on that stretch of highway. No one dares to drive that road at night anymore, because it's said that he hasn't left yet.